Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History Value podcast. And today I'm joined by Jennifer Fishburne. And today we'll be discussing what caused Jennifer to leave Christianity to become preterist and then to leave preterism to become atheist. So we're just going to cover it in chronological order just like that. And I have the link to her YouTube channel tagged in the title and in the description below. It's called Answers from Genesis. So check out her channel and subscribe to it if you haven't already done so. And that being said, it's good to have you back on the show, Jennifer. It's been a while.
Yes, good to see you again, Jacob.
Likewise, Jennifer. Let's start off with what caused you to leave Christianity to become preterist, and can you define what preterism is for those that are not familiar with that?
Yeah, so just to start off here, I was still a Christian when I was a full preterist. So it's not leaving one to become another. Just want to make that clear. So full preterism basically is the eschatological position that Jesus already came back in AD 70. There's a couple of different views. The two main views are, one is partial preterism, where he came back, but he didn't quite do everything. And then full preterism is where he came back and all prophecies were fulfilled by AD 70. And so that was basically the end of the Bible, the end of the story. So what do you want to know exactly?
What caused preterists to think that Jesus already came back, that everything had already happened? And so if that is the case, what is the point of the belief system going forward? How does that work?
Yeah, well, that's why there's so many different variations within preterism now, just like there are 46,000 different, or however many, whatever your number is, right? Different denominations of Christianity. Everybody comes up with their own idea, their own interpretation, their own concept of what that kind of means, right? So as far as, what is there left for us today? It was when I got to the point where I realized there's nothing for us today that I did leave Christianity. But it took me a long time to come to that realization. I'm trying to think. So I became a preterist in 2011, and I left Christianity altogether in 2017. So it was probably 6 years for me of actually searching and trying to figure out, okay, actually, the first article I wrote was, if the Bible is all about Israel, what's left for us today? And that's what we talked about on the last time that I was on your show, right?
Yeah.
And so that took me about 6 years to work through all of that. And I looked at every single doctrine in the Bible trying to figure out, okay, well, if this happened already, then how does that apply to me? So if Jesus already came back in AD 70, where is salvation in the Bible for me today? That was one of the very first ones to go, right? And I couldn't find it. Literally, I could not find it anywhere. I searched through every passage in the whole Bible that had to do with salvation. And actually what I figured out was, okay, it's not in the Old Testament at all. So the word for salvation in the Old Testament was deliverance. And it usually had to do with war. So I began, as I'm going through this search, I began to see that the words in the Bible, in our English Bible, don't always mean what we think they mean, or they're what I call church words. And so I started just searching every church word. So faith was one of them. If there's no salvation, then what do I need faith for? What do I have faith in? If Jesus already came back, people accuse me of taking away their hope. But what do we have hope for? If there's no salvation, there's no faith, Jesus already came back, what do you have hope for? And, well, I'm not the one taking away your hope. What if the hope is in something that doesn't exist, like heaven, right? And then I started looking at these things. Well, does heaven exist? Does hell exist, right? So the first one that went, one of the very first ones that went for me was hell. And if hell doesn't exist, then okay, is everybody going to heaven? So I got on that train for a short period of time. where I was just like, well, it must be universalism then. Everybody's going to heaven if hell doesn't exist, until I started to research heaven, right? So for me, it was one after another that the dominoes kind of fell. And I was researching topic after topic after topic within the Bible, as, still a Christian, still loving the Lord with all my heart, still believing, that somehow God existed and had, loved us, and all of this stuff was still for us, even though the whole Bible was all about Israel. So there was a lot of cognitive dissonance going on there for me, and I had to reconcile it. And so that's how I reconciled it, was just thousands and thousands of hours of deep study.
What causes preterists to think that Jesus already came back? And how do they understand the kingdom of God in that context? Like this new world, that the world being remade, in a sense, that the kingdom of heaven coming down upon the earth. Like, how does that work in the mind of a preterist?
So not all preterists agree on that. But what causes people to become preterists is basically two things. So number one is called audience relevance. And it's something that we do anytime we read any book, any letter, we watch a TV show, a movie, or anything like that. We never go into a movie theater, for example, and think this movie is about me. This movie is telling me that this is going to be the end of the world for me. This is going to happen to me. I'm going to, win this award. I'm going to win this game. We don't ever go into any other genre of literature and think that. The Bible is literally the only one that we go in and we put ourselves in the middle of somebody else's story and say, this book is about me. And so preterists realize, no, it's not. So what we ask ourselves is, who said it and who are they talking to? So one of my favorite examples is when Jesus said, you have not chosen me, but I have chosen you. So when I was a Calvinist, that was a pet passage that Calvinists used to say, hey, you know what? God chose me. But if we look at that passage in the Bible, who is Jesus speaking to? Do you know? Do you remember?
Where is this passage located again?
I don't know. You don't ask me those kind of things, because I can't remember those kind of numbers. But what he's saying, he's talking to his disciples. So he's talking about, he chose his disciples. So these were the 12 disciples that he chose. It has nothing to do with you and me, right? So when we look at the books of the New Testament, let's just assume that the authors that are attributed to them have actually written them. I don't believe that they have, but let's just assume that they have, right? So who are they writing to? So Paul's epistles are pretty easy, because he wrote 2 of them to the Corinthians, he wrote to the Galatians, he wrote to the Ephesians, he wrote to the Philippians, he wrote to the Colossians, he wrote to Timothy, a couple of them, right? He wrote to Titus. He wrote all of these things, and we know who he's writing to. So do you belong to the first century church of Corinth? No, right? Neither you nor I, nor anybody today, not even Israelites today, Israelis today, we would call them, right? None of them belong to the first century church of Corinth. So Paul was writing them a letter. It had nothing to do with us today. So that's the first thing that where full preterists kind of start asking those questions. And those are the who, what, where, when, why, and how questions that we learned. At least I learned it when I was in 5th grade. I learned to ask those questions, right? And so when we ask those questions about the Bible, well, then we don't find ourselves anywhere. Now that takes a long time. It's a very, very much of a paradigm shift to see that, my name's not written in there 1,200 times. I think there's the U Bible or something, and they actually put your name in it 1,200 places. No, that's fake. It's not about us. So that's the first thing that preterists, that causes people to believe in full preterism. And then the second thing is what we call time statements. And so those are statements, and one guy, David Green, has put together a list of, he calls 101 preterist time statements. And so they're just statements that show that the people in the first century expected Jesus to come back in their lifetime. And it's been so many years now, I can't quote any verses anymore.
It's like that part when Jesus tells his disciples, "Some of you will not taste death before the Son of Man comes."
That's right.
Yeah.
Right. Right. So there are 101 very, very clear passages in the New Testament that are talking about things happening soon. It's going to be at hand. It's going to be quickly. It's going to be before some of you die. It's going to be in this generation. And a generation we can say is either 40 years in the Bible or less. So it could be even 14 years, because in their time, people were having kids by the time they were 13, 14 years old. So that was when the next generation started, was about 14 years. So it's going to be anywhere between 14 and 40 years, depending on how you want to look at it, but it's not any longer than that. So this generation, so that was 2,000 years ago. So this generation has nothing to do with us today. So the book's about Israel, and it's about first century Israel. So when we start looking at all those, then we can take, now this is where your history comes in, right? Because that's your part of it. This is where all the things that happen in history in the first century in Jerusalem pretty much line up with what was supposed to happen. You know, it's funny when people say, well, there's more earthquakes, there's more wars, that kind of stuff. And Jesus said there was going to be those. There's stuff like that happening all the time. It never stops, right?
Right.
So what was he talking about? Well, specifically, the ones that were coming up next, right? The ones that were coming up really soon. So not talking about wars that they were going to happen 2,000 years later. How many thousands of wars have we had since then? Literally thousands.
Yeah.
You know, so it's not just the Russia-Ukraine war. That's not the one that Jesus is picking to come back. You know, the Israel and Gaza war. That's not the one that Jesus is picking to come back. You know, so kind of a combination of all of those things.
And I guess I can kind of understand what makes them think that, because I mean that is what the Gospels are saying, that it's supposed to happen very quickly, very soon, but it didn't happen. So it's like the idea of failed prophecies is another step further. That okay, it didn't happen.
So
at
there
all,
are
yeah.
so there are a couple of different ideas on what that meant. So in full preterism, there's covenantal eschatology, and I only loosely followed that. It wasn't my thing, but basically it was that all of it was done metaphorically, spiritually, you know, kind of, that's the kingdom part that you were talking about, where it's all inward, right? And so they had this, the resurrection wasn't a physical resurrection, but it was a spiritual resurrection, and they became new people, you know, spiritually. And that Jesus didn't literally come back in the clouds, but what he did was all of the history things that came true were representative of what was happening as the change from the old covenant to the new covenant. Again, Israel, Hebrews 8, right? The new covenant is with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. That was the one that got me. Actually, that's what put me over the edge into full preterism. Only the house of Israel, the house of Judah. So all of these things happened, but inwardly. So that's one view. Another view is that it depends on what you mean by the various prophecies. So in 2 Peter 3, when they're talking about the elements will burn up with fire, one of the views, and I think Ed Stevens is the one who has this particular view, and I tended to agree with his more on this, was that the elements there were the literal elements, gold and silver, within the temple. And that's truly what happened, right? They burned, and the elements were, you know, so not one stone was left upon another, you know, that truly happened. So, you know, a lot of these things happened physically, and the ones that didn't happen physically, they basically say, well, that happened inwardly. That was a spiritual transformation.
So I guess what they're doing is they're taking passages like the kingdom of heaven is within you and applying that metaphorical context.
Yes.
Mm. So what led you to start questioning the preterist interpretation of the New Testament into leading to your deconversion and becoming atheist?
So it really had nothing to do with preterism, but it was while I was within preterism that I began seeing all of these different things. So it really, for me, it started before preterism. So preterism was the second domino to fall for me.
Mhm.
So the first one was the law of Moses. And this is kind of important in my own journey, basically. So I was in various groups that the law of Moses was very, very important in my life. And I tried to live my life according to the law of Moses. And so I thought that I was being consistent. And so as I am living my life this way, there was a seminary professor from Dallas Theological Seminary who came online, and I had said something about we're still under the law of Moses, and he came online and he challenged me. And so he offered to do a Bible study with me, and I was not about to change my mind lightly. It had to, he had to really, 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 really show me. So I did this Bible study. I studied about 12 hours a day for 90 days. And it took that long for me to realize that, no, we are not under the old covenant. That was Israel. It was the people who were standing on Mount Sinai at the time. That's who the old covenant was given to. It was never given to me. It never applied to me. It had nothing to do with me. So when we get to Matthew 5:17 and 18, and Jesus says, I have not come to destroy the law and the prophets, but I have come to fulfill them. So I came to clearly understand that Jesus fulfilled the law. And so I asked my seminary professor, I said, well, what about the prophets? If he fulfilled the law, this verse has them together. Did he fulfill the prophets as well? And he couldn't answer my question. And so that's what got me started on full preterism. And so as I get into full preterism, then I see that the new covenant is only for the law, for the house of Israel, the house of Judah. So then it's like, well, how are we saved today? How do we get into their full covenant? I mean, into their new covenant, right? We don't. There's nothing in the Bible that says that we have any part in the new covenant whatsoever. So then I was like, how are we saved? There's nothing in the Bible that says we have any way to be saved into Israel's new covenant. In fact, because what salvation was from salvation in the Bible was from judgment according to the law of Moses, the old covenant, for the sins that were committed under the old covenant. So because I was never under the old covenant, I did not commit any sins under the old covenant. So I don't need to be saved from that judgment. And that judgment was only against old covenant Israel. And that judgment came in AD 70. So the only people who need to be saved from that judgment were the people who were alive in the first century. And the Israelites were the only ones who were under that covenant. So it was only first century Israelites that needed to be saved from that old covenant judgment. Therefore, there's no need for any salvation for anybody today. So the word salvation is literally deliverance. And so that's what they were being delivered from. They were being delivered from the judgment of the old covenant into the more freedom type of a kingdom of heaven type of thing of the new covenant. Again, only Israel. So they were making changes within their own constitution, basically. You could say it was a constitutional change for the state of Israel, the biblical state of Israel. All right. So we don't need salvation because it had nothing to do with us, right? The judgment. And so then everything started falling very, very, very quickly after that. If I don't need salvation, I don't need faith. If I don't need salvation, there is no hell that I have to worry about going to. Does heaven exist? What do I need hope for? All of these kinds of things. And I literally studied all these. So grace, that was a big one. So there's a big movement, a grace movement within Christianity, right? So what is grace? Grace is not having to pay that penalty for the judgment. What judgment? The Old Testament law of Moses. If you violate those sins, then God was going to show mercy in the New Testament for those people. That's the only thing that grace had to do with, was against the judgment of the Old Testament law. So, for example, if there's a court today and there's somebody who's accused of murder, and the judge shows them grace or mercy, right? And they just say, nope, we're not gonna charge you. Does that apply to me? Has nothing to do with me, right? So the grace and the mercy of the New Testament has nothing to do with us either. So when I started looking at all of these, what I call church words, then I realized it never had anything to do with me. This whole story was all about Israel, and really ended in the 1st century. So how did I get out of that, right? I'm going through this process, and I'm getting to the point where I'm like, I've kind of discovered, I guess at the end of all of this, what I did was I took a year and I wrote a commentary on the whole Bible. This was my last ditch effort to say, the Bible still has something to do with me. So I wrote a commentary on the whole Bible. It was a huge amount of work. And as I did that, I began to see problems. And it's not just your typical little problems that sometimes atheists bring up, which I'm not a fan of. This number doesn't match that number, or, this passage doesn't match that passage. If I go back to the Hebrew and the Greek, I can tell you why that works. And I could, tell you why everything lines up perfectly in the Bible. So when atheists do that, that's not me. That's not who I am. I don't agree with that. But I remember clearly one of them was a passage, and I don't remember which one it was. It was in the prophets, probably Isaiah. I don't remember now. And I was looking up something that it said, and the Lord said, blah, 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 blah. And when I was looking it up in history, actually the god Marduk had said that before. And I said, wait a minute. I thought, up until this point, I thought that the Bible was written first, and then all those other mythologies had borrowed from the Bible. So that got me started down on that trail. It was like, who was first? The other gods, the Greek gods, the Roman gods, the Egyptian gods, the Assyrian gods, the Babylonian gods, all these, were they first? Were their stories first? Or were the Bible stories first? Well, I think that's pretty clear, right? So the Bible stories are last. They're the ones who borrowed from all those others. And then I start thinking, well, is it true then? If they borrowed their stories from the other gods, the other lands, the other nations, who's true? Are they true? Why do we reject all those other mythology stories? We say, oh, those are just myths, right? But we think the Bible stories are true when most of them are actually borrowed from other gods. So that didn't make sense to me. And then I started reading all of Bart Ehrman's books, and and started learning about how Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John did not write Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, and that definitely no eyewitnesses wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Half of Paul's epistles were definitely not written by Paul. And there just seemed to be a whole lot of problems in the New Testament authorship. And so then I'm like, okay, well, certainly we must have some evidence that Jesus, really did some of these things. And, they just kind of played the telephone game. It was written down a little bit later, but still it was probably true. And when I started looking into all of it, it's like, actually, no, we have zero evidence that Jesus did anything. We have zero evidence that he actually existed. The best that we have are 7 epistles that Paul wrote, because half of them we know he didn't write, at least. So we base our whole belief system on 6 letters that Paul wrote. And who is Paul? Paul is like, he had a dream. That's all we've got. He never saw Jesus. He didn't see him do anything. He had a dream. Literally, that's all we have. So how is that different from Joseph Smith? And so that led me just right out. As a truth seeker, I was like, there's nowhere else for me to go. What's the evidence for God? That was the last one for me. What's the evidence for God? I went looking. My family are biblical archaeologists and missionaries. That's my family's background. So I thought for sure, I used to read the biblical archaeological study Bible, I think is the name of it. I used to just read that from cover to cover because I was sure that it just proved everything about the Bible. But now that I look back on it, it's like it didn't prove anything. Yeah, they found a piece of pottery. What does that mean? It doesn't mean anything. It means that Israel had pots. We know that Israel existed, right? But it doesn't mean that that pot meant anything, that it belonged to anybody, or that there was any meaning behind it, or it proved any story. Or, my uncle found a burn mark on Mount Sinai, and he said that proved that God came down and gave Moses the 10 Commandments there. No, it doesn't. It just says that there was a fire there sometime, or that there was a dark spot on the mountain. It doesn't prove anything. So those were hard ones for me to give up. Noah's Ark. My family found Noah's Ark. My family found the chariot wheels in the Red Sea. Those were hard for me to give up. But I had to realize, if there was a chariot wheel, that doesn't mean it belonged to Pharaoh. It doesn't mean that the waters opened up. It doesn't mean Moses went across. It doesn't mean that a million Israelites went across. It just means that there used to be a land bridge there. And the waters used to go up and down like the tides before they built in these man-made constructs to keep it from going up and down every year. And there used to be a land bridge, and they would cross over once a year when the water would go down. And if a wheel broke, well, the wheel broke, and they probably just left it right where it broke. That does not mean it had anything to do with Moses or the Israelites, So I had to give up those kind of things. And those were hard for me to give up.
We have a super chat question from Jesus Tales. Thank you for your super chat. Can you be an atheist preterist? I think all the prophecies were fulfilled before those books were written.
Yeah, so that is that's a good question. So I don't say that I'm not a preterist, but I do say that it's still probably the best way to look at the story if you were a Christian, right? Now, I don't believe the story is real anymore. So I do believe Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written after AD 70, and they were written in order to kind of show the things that happened in AD 70. And so, I don't think that, I certainly don't call myself a preterist today, but if I was to look at the story, it's, I think, the best way to explain the story, except that the story is really just fiction. It's mythology. It's brilliant literature. I do think it is absolutely one of the most brilliant pieces of literature ever. The people who wrote it and wove together so many different pieces of it, that was genius. It really was. Doesn't make it true. But so, am I an atheist preterist? I'm an atheist who saw preterism as the best explanation for the Bible at the time I was a Christian. That's the best I can do.
When you say that preterism is the best way to look at it, if one were to look at it from a Christian point of view, that would have to do with that that the text is trying to say that it was supposed to happen in the first century, that Jesus is going to come back soon within the generation.
Exactly.
When you went through this journey, what were some of the most other difficult parts of it that you can remember?
I think what I've noticed, not only for me, but for other people when they're going through deconstruction, is that the first domino to fall is always the hardest. And it's the one that you have to admit that you believed a lie, whatever that first domino is. And it's different for every single person, right? For me, it was the law of Moses. I could not believe that I had believed this lie all my life. And then for many, it is eschatology. Whatever it is that you believe about eschatology, that's usually a very difficult one. And that's why I think so many preterists are afraid to look at anything else, because going through becoming a preterist means you usually lose a lot of friends. Maybe some family members will say some hateful things. You probably lose your church, and you lose your sense of the security and the knowing and everything that you've had your whole life. And all of a sudden you're like, wait a minute, I believed a lie my whole life. And that's a horrible place to be, right? And so a lot of people, when they go through that first one, whether it's preterism or anything else, it's like, I don't want to do that again. That was too hard. That destroyed my life. I don't want to do that again. But I want to say, for anybody who is going through deconstruction and might be listening to this, that if you've already made one step, that was the hardest step. And everything after that will get easier and easier and easier. So for me, I think the second one to go was maybe hell, and then eschatology. Now, I'd been studying all the different eschatology views at that time, and I wasn't really married to one. So it wasn't as difficult for me because I had really, really looked at them all and seen the value of each different position, and I could understand them all. I think I think giving up salvation was super hard, because, I love Jesus with all my heart. He was my savior. I talked to him all the time. I had this imaginary relationship, which I thought was real. And, that was very hard. Giving up the relationships themselves were very, very hard. Realizing that I was praying to air, that was super hard. So, and then sometimes it's kind of like, well, what do you do now? Normally I would pray in this situation. My daughter was dying in the hospital. I'm like, what do I do now? Normally I'd sit here and pray to Jesus to help, heal her. Well, then you just do real life. And that's hard to learn how to do real life without Christianity attached to it, right? It's hard to learn how to sit there and actually do medical stuff and let the doctors do their stuff and not have to pray to some imaginary being that doesn't exist. So those were some of the hard things, I think, for me.
And when you walked away from preterism, how did your interaction with preterists go after that?
Well, it wasn't that I really walked away from preterism, because when I did my first video, I titled it Why I Left Christianity. And going through preterism was a big reason of why I left Christianity. But at that time, I still considered myself a preterist. So really, it was more as I became atheistic. So for a while, I said I was atheistic toward the God of the Bible. I didn't believe the God of the Bible exists. Now, just for anybody who wants to know, I am 100% hardcore atheist. I don't believe any God exists anywhere. I'm not agnostic about it. I don't have this, I don't know, maybe something. No, not 100% atheist, right? So as I'm going through all of that, more and more preterists start to pull away from me the farther away I get, because I'm studying these kind of things. But really, I would say most preterists left me when I talked about Israel being the story of the Bible was only all about Israel. That was when most preterists turned their back on me. They didn't like that part of it. They wanted to pick and choose what parts were for Israel and what parts were for us today. And that's what I find very funny, actually, about full preterists who believe in audience relevance, and yet they still pick out verses of the Bible and say, well, these still apply to us today. I'm like, well, who is that written to? Or who did they say that to? You're not there. You're not in that Bible anywhere. That's when people started pulling away from me.
So when you became fully atheist, did you change your interpretation about the text focusing on Israel, or do you still think that it pretty much just focuses on Israel anyway and is not relevant either way?
Yeah. So I am convinced that it is Israel's, I now call the Bible Israel's book of mythology. It is no different from Egypt's book of mythology or Greece's book of mythology or Rome or, anybody else. It is literally Israel's book of mythology. The only difference is that some people think it's real.
So when it comes to Paul, and as you know, he's called the apostle to the Gentiles, and he preaches to Gentiles, and like with Israel only, they'll say the Gentiles are actually Israelites somehow. So what do you make of that view?
Yeah. So we have to understand, this is another term, what I call church words. So we need to really understand what the words were when they were written at the time that they were written. So these books were really written 2,000 years ago, right? So we have to understand, what did they mean at that time? What was that word? So in today, in Israel, the country of Israel today, the word Gentile means somebody who's not Jewish, not an Israelite, they don't even call it Israelite, not an Israeli, right? That means there's somebody who's not Jewish. Basically, that's what. And if you think about the word Jewish, they're almost right. So you think about the word Jewish. The Jewish comes from house of Judah. That was 2.5 tribes. Now, the house of Israel was the other 9.5 tribes, right? So the house of Israel are people who are not Jews. Okay? So in the Bible, we have 2 groups. We have Jews and we have the people who are not Jews, but they're always Israelites. So they're the 9.5 tribes. So if we look at the book of Hosea, the whole book of Hosea, however you want to say it, is bringing the 2 groups together, the 2 houses together. The Judah and Israel, the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom, however you want to call them, they had all different kinds of names, right? So they were divided, and then they were scattered. They were sent to Assyria. They were sent to Babylon. Later on, they kind of ended up in Corinth. They ended up in Galatia and Ephesians. They ended up in Rome. They ended up in all of these different places. And Paul went out, and he was the missionary to these groups. And who were these groups? They were the people who were not Jews. They were still Israelites, but they were not Jews. So they're the other part of Israel. They were the northern kingdom. The Jews were the southern kingdom. So they called them Gentiles. Now, Gentiles is a really, 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 really bad translation. So the translation, whether it's in Hebrew, ethnos, or Greek, now I'm forgetting. I can't remember. Anyway, the Hebrew or the Greek, the words that we have translated as Gentiles should be, and originally meant something like nation, only nation doesn't mean like United States. Nation means more like a very, very, very small group of related people. So tribe is a really good word for that. And if we think of like an American Indian tribe, they were fairly small. And that would be about the same kind of thing that we would think of with the tribe, the 12 tribes of Israel, right? So a tribe in Israel, each one was related. We know who their father was. We know Benjamin and Judah and Levi. We know who their father was. And each one of them, they were related group of people. So that's literally what the word means in the original, is a small group of related people. It has nothing to do with people outside the nation of Israel. It was the 12 tribes of Israel, and that's who they're talking about. Now, in each passage, you have to look at it in context, but Paul was the apostle to the 9.5 tribes of northern Israel who were scattered across the various nations after they had their big fight and split. But they were still Israel.
And what would your advice be to preterists that are struggling and are on their way to becoming fully atheist?
Well, come talk to me or come talk to some of the other full preterists who have become atheists. We'd be glad to help you, definitely. But my advice is the same critical thinking skills that got you to full preterism to begin with is the same things that is going to take you all the way out, and at least out of Christianity and as far as you want to go. Now, I'm not the only full preterist who says I never wanted to be an atheist, but I'm a truth seeker. And most full preterists are truth seekers. And so if you're going to seriously seek just the truth, you're going to end up as atheism, because that's where the truth will, and that's where you will end up if you're just seeking truth. When I left, I thought I'd just walk away and never have anything to do with it again. That was what, 4 years ago. But people started asking me all these questions like, oh, well, maybe I should look at this. Maybe I should look at that. Maybe I should look at all these other things. And so that's what actually took me out, completely out and into atheism, and people challenged me. Well, why don't you have the answer to this? And why don't you have the answer to that? And I'm like, hey, I just left Christianity. I didn't say I had the answer to all the questions in the world, you know, but keep searching. They already know, full preterists already know critical thinking skills. There's no reason to stop. The first step is the hardest. After that, it gets easier. On the outside is the best. There is nothing like being outside of Christianity. Nothing like it.
And so when you left Christianity all the way, did you feel a sense of liberation?
Absolutely.
Could you describe what you felt?
Well, it kind of changes over time. You know, it wasn't like a one day thing, you know, that it wasn't like praying the prayer to become a Christian, you know, where you have that emotional release. It was, for me, it was gradual as I'm going out. And then just one day I realized, hey, I'm not a Christian anymore. And when I realized that I don't have to blame Satan for the bad things, I don't have to give God credit for the good things, especially the good things that I do. If I work really hard and I accomplish something, there's no reason why I shouldn't take credit for that. And why should I give God credit for something that I actually did? You know, that was a biggie. Then realizing that I'm in control of my life. And if things go really bad, well, that's on me. And if things go really good, well, then I worked hard for it. And then I have a lot of control. Realizing that I have one life to live, and it is a gift. And if I blow this one life hoping that the next one's going to be better, then I've wasted the one life that I completely have. And I think that's a big, big, big deal on why I want to help Christians to leave Christianity, because I hate to see people waste their whole life living in Christianity, hoping that the next one's going to be better, blaming the devil for this, and, you know, giving God credit for everything. And, you know, it's a whole waste of a complete life.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Jennifer Fishburne.
You're welcome.
And I want to remind everybody to go check out her channel. It is tagged in the title, and in the description below. It's called Answers from Genesis.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.